Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Eulis here. Okay, today let's talk about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum Heist. As many of you know, that's also one of the cold cases that I've been looking into for quite some time now, in addition to, of course, the D.B. Cooper case. I've got some big news. I think some big news, a big update with respect to my investigation into the Gardner Museum Heist. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit about this today, very briefly, because I want to kind of break this out into several shorter videos as opposed to one very long video. So, first of all, let me just kind of lay the groundwork and give you an idea of where this comes from, where this information, where these ideas and notions that I'm about to put forward to you come from. And they come from here. Here's a big part of it right here. This right here represents about 3 years worth of journal kept by a woman named Stephanie Rabinowitz, who is a former girlfriend of a suspect named Brian McDevitt. Now, Brian's no longer alive. He passed away in 2004, but he became a suspect in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist almost immediately after the heist. And I know that he was being surveilled by the FBI within a matter of weeks from when the heist occurred, which again was the very early morning hours of March 18th, 1990, there in Boston, Massachusetts, at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Now, Brian is somebody that has been interviewed by the FBI, or rather was interviewed by the FBI on multiple occasions. He did actually sit before a grand jury in 1993. Ultimately, he ended up, I guess, fleeing is the way to put it, fleeing or leaving the United States in 1993 for South America. Brazil originally, ended up in Colombia, where he passed away in 2004. So he never came back. Brian actually never came back once he left. But Stephanie, his former girlfriend, is somebody who, with whom Brian met in July of 1989. So just, a handful of months, half a year or so before the heist took place, a little bit more than half a year, I guess. And Stephanie kept in contact with him until July of 1992. It was July of 92 when Stephanie last spoke with Brian. Now, what's important about these journals here is, again, this is about 3 years worth of journals that covers the period of time that Stephanie and Brian knew each other, and including the very critical part over the heist itself. And it's about 800 pages worth of writing there. Obviously, it's not 800 pages that deals exclusively with Brian. It deals with kind of everyday life. But I think it's critically important to understanding what happened, or what I believe happened. I am the only person who has read cover to cover these 800 pages of journal, with the exception being Stephanie as well. Now, the FBI has received several critical excerpts from these 800 pages because the FBI did actually interview Stephanie on 2 occasions, once in 1992 as well as once in 2004. Now, interestingly, the FBI was not even aware that Stephanie kept these journals until 2004. And it was at that time in 2004 when Stephanie actually communicated with Jeffrey Kelly with the FBI there in Boston, and actually forwarded, faxed actually several excerpts, critical excerpts to him from the diaries. And here's the fax. I mean, I've got the actual fax from May 4th, 2004 to Jeffrey Kelly. And after the fax was sent, Jeffrey Kelly actually flew to Boston with another FBI agent and interviewed Stephanie in Seattle. She was living in Seattle at this time. So why this is important is because while the FBI does have their hands on some information that is clearly relevant, they don't have their hands on all of the information, or no one took the time to actually read cover to cover all of the information. And I think it speaks to the truth of what actually happened here. So I'm going to kind of give you a brief summary here for this kind of first in a series of videos related to this, that talks a little bit about what I believe happened. And I want to say that these aren't just theories and things that I pulled out of thin air. Invariably, there's something that I can point to that explains why it is that I believe that things happened the way they did. So I'll start off by saying that I believe that the two thieves involved with the heist were Brian McDevitt and a friend of his named Steve Donahue. Now here's a picture of Brian and Steve. Brian is on the left, on your left, as you're looking at the picture, and Steve is on the right. Now, so these are the two guys that I believe were actually the thieves that night that ripped off the art at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I do believe it was an inside job. Now, I believe that one of the guards, Rick Abbott, was sort of the inside man. Now, this is just my belief. This is my theory. I should say that I can't 1000% prove it. Obviously, he hasn't been prosecuted or anything of that nature, so I want to be very clear about this. This is just speaking to what I believe the evidence shows as far as this case took place. So I believe that Rick was involved. I'm not exactly sure how he would have gotten involved. I do think he was kind of a passive participant, meaning it is entirely possible that Brian just strong-armed the guy. Maybe he was a willing, participant to some degree. I don't really know, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was ultimately approached by Brian and Brian somehow kind of strong-armed him to some degree. Now, it's very interesting to note that when Brian first started dating Stephanie, or Stephanie first started dating Brian, the majority of their time was actually spent in and around Brian's place, which was on Beacon Hill, lived literally right across the street from the state capitol there. So most of their time was spent right there, Beacon Hill area, Boston, as well as downtown Boston. One thing I noticed through reading these diaries and these journals and so forth is that dynamic changed as within a few months of the heist. All of a sudden, Brian was spending a lot more time at Stephanie's place, and that's where they would frequent, were areas around Stephanie's place. Now, why this is notable is because she lived in the Allston area of Boston, which is a small area, small kind of neighborhood area of Boston. It's also just so happens to be where Rick Abbott, the aforementioned guard, also lived. In particular, there's one venue called Harper's Ferry, no longer in business, but it was a music venue there, well-known music venue, Harper's Ferry, that Stephanie would frequent pretty regularly. She was there with Brian on multiple occasions. This is documented in her journals contemporaneously, and it is, I think, notable that Rick Abbott, if you measure as the crow flies, the distance from Rick Abbott's old place there in Austin to Harper's Ferry, again, this very popular venue, 700 feet. He lives 700 feet away. So, and I do know from having talked with Stephanie that Brian did tell her that he knew somebody, he had a friend, he had a colleague that lived in the Austin area, and he would occasionally meet with this person during that period of time when Brian was spending more time in Austin with Stephanie. Didn't name names or anything like that. Brian would kind of take off for a few hours and come back to Stephanie's apartment, that kind of thing. But it is an interesting and intriguing thing to consider. So I do believe that it was an inside job. Now, I believe that Brian's plan was to actually sell this artwork, once heisted, was to sell this artwork to an international drug ring based in Jamaica that had ties to South America as well. And again, there are a number of reasons why I believe that. It is important to note that Brian and Stephanie actually did travel to Jamaica in December of 1989. I've got many pictures there, and Steve Donahue was in Jamaica as well. Now, Steve Donahue lived in Jamaica, so I think that Steve played a critical part in sort of putting this entire thing together in Jamaica. It's important to note as well, and this is from the journals, that I can put Steve Donahue in Boston 13 days before the heist. I don't know when he left, but I know with certainty that he was in Boston 13 days before the heist. And at this point, this is the first time that Stephanie recalls seeing him in Boston. And again, Stephanie originally met Brian in July of '89, so we're talking many months later, 13 days before the heist, March of 1990, when Steve Donahue all of a sudden appears in Boston. So it's another one of those very intriguing things that's buried in these journals here that I think speak to what happened here. Now, okay, so Brian's plan, go ahead and rip off the art, sell it to this international drug ring in Jamaica for the purposes of letting the drug ring use it as collateral, because they would use high dollar art. They would use art like this for collateral, for purposes of collateral. In fact, this drug ring actually possessed art from an Italian museum that had been stolen in October of 1987. There was a theft of a museum in Italy. The artwork at that time was valued at $8.2 million. It made its way to London, and ultimately from London was shipped to Jamaica, made it through customs in Jamaica. Obviously there was somebody on the take there in Jamaica, and the artwork ended up there. Now, Brian ran into a couple of problems though with this Jamaica deal that he had cooked up here. First of all, he ripped off $200 million worth of art, which of course means that this was instantly radioactive. It was all over the news everywhere internationally. Now, if Brian had just ripped off, a simple painting or two for $5 million, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But $200 million is a little bit difficult to sweep under the rug. So that's the first problem, is it was kind of radioactive as far as that goes. And Stephanie actually speaks to this, that Brian is having quote unquote problems at work in the weeks immediately following the heist. Now, it's important to note that Stephanie is completely unaware of Brian's past, Brian's history. He tried to rob a museum in 1980 in upstate New York. The MO was very, very similar to the Gardner heist in 1990. He was caught, went to prison for a few months. But Stephanie was unaware of this. So when she's writing and talking about discussions and things with Brian, she's thinking that he's a writer for the Wonder Years, writing scripts, things of this nature. She has no idea the true story behind Brian McDevitt. So that's part of what makes her writing so valuable, is because they're contemporaneous and it's not a colored perspective. She's not influenced by anything. So I think it's notable, and I think it's very interesting when she talks about Brian having problems at work around April 11th. There's one specific post in particular, or writing in April 11th, just a few weeks after. And I think that this speaks to Brian having some problems closing a deal with these Jamaican guys for this artwork that Brian and Steve ripped off. And then there was a very big problem that occurred a couple of weeks after that. 39 days after the Gardner Museum heist, April 26, 1990, this international drug ring in Jamaica was busted. They got busted in the Italian art that I referenced that was worth $8.2 million that had been stolen in October of 1987 from a museum in Italy, was recovered there. And there were people who went to jail. So effectively that art ring is bingo, it's gone. They're using the art for collateral, and the drug trade is gone. And I think at that point, Brian's in a world of hurt. He no longer has a customer. He no longer has a prospective buyer as far as this, $200 million worth of art is concerned. So it is important to note that right around June 1st of 1990, so, a couple of months after the heist took place, Brian did pack up all his belongings in a van and drove to California and moved to California to a Hollywood Hills home, a home in the Hollywood Hills there. I do believe that the artwork was burned, was destroyed in the fireplace of that Hollywood Hills home. And I won't get into all the specifics right now, but there was a lot that I have learned talking with other people, reading media reports and so forth from the early 90s that I think speak to the fact that this artwork was actually destroyed in the Hollywood Hills home shortly after or some months after the heist took place. Now I want to put a caveat on this here. There were two bronze pieces. There was a bronze eagle finial, and there was also a bronze Chinese coup that were taken. Obviously those were not burned. Those were likely buried, because you can't burn those in a fireplace, so those are likely buried. And the reason I think they're buried, again, relates to something that Brian wrote. He was writing basically what ostensibly was a movie script or a show script that spoke to a heist, a museum heist, and a couple of thieves that sort of bumbling thieves in a way almost. They had a half-baked idea. They ripped off this museum. They almost couldn't believe that they were successful at it. Kind of ran into some problems selling the stuff and ended up having to destroy it, except as the script goes, there are a couple of metal statues that had to be buried because they couldn't be burned. I think it's a situation where it's really art mimicking true life here. I think that really largely speaks to what happened to it. So the 2 bronze pieces would still be around. And there's one other thing I should say. I have reason to believe that the Chez Tortoni as well also may not have left Boston, may not have left Massachusetts. So it is possible that the Chez Tortoni, the one item that was taken from the Blue Room on the first floor, it is possible that that piece is also still around. Now, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say it probably ended up in California and in the fireplace as well. But having said that, it is possible that it never left Massachusetts, and it may still exist today. And if it still exists today, I think there's a reasonably good chance it's somewhere in the Boston area. So, hopefully there's a few pieces that are still out there. Actually, hopefully all of the stuff is still out there, and I'm wrong about this, but I have a feeling that this stuff was destroyed again years ago. So, one of the intriguing things, a couple of the intriguing things that I've dug out of Stephanie's diaries that speak to some of this stuff. I can put Brian at a New England museum in January of 1990, just a couple of months before the heist took place, which is something that, as far as I know, the FBI is unaware of. One other thing that's notable is that Brian had a very interesting conversation with Stephanie May 6, 1991, and the nature of the conversation, or the tenor of the conversation, was such that Brian revealed a very big and remarkable story to Stephanie at that time. And I believe what he revealed to Stephanie, she doesn't recollect all the details, but I believe that essentially what Brian revealed to her was his involvement in the Gardner heist. Probably didn't specifically mention the name of the museum, but I think he mentioned something to the fact that he was involved in that, and that some of these items had been destroyed. There are a number of reasons why I feel this way. There are references in the comment that Stephanie wrote in her diary that point specifically to the timing of the Gardner Museum heist, which at that point had been 14 or 15 months earlier. And then there's also another post a few days later where Stephanie expresses concern that the FBI may be listening in on her conversation. I believe the FBI does not have that excerpt either. So I believe that they're unaware of that comment. And again, this is what I'm talking about. There are critical pieces there that I think speak to what actually happened here. And you lose context, you lose texture unless somebody's willing to take the time to read the 800 pages and speaks to exactly what happened and when and so forth. So to make a long story short, I'm of the opinion that the artwork was already destroyed by the time May 6, 1991 arrived. Brian happened to be visiting from LA in Boston and actually spoke with Stephanie, had lunch with Stephanie at that time. And this is where a lot of this information has come out there. So now, as far as the fireplace is concerned, I have been to the Hollywood Hills home on a couple of occasions. I was recently there with Stephanie in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, looking at the fireplace. Very fortunately for me, one of the things that I discovered is that the fireplace has, in the back bottom floor of it, it has a metal flap that opens up to like a cave, or I don't want to say cave, but a cavity. There's a large sort of cavity, large area underneath it. So back in the old days, what would happen is you burn whatever you're burning in the fireplace, you lift up that metal flap and you put all the ash down there, all the ash and debris down there, and then you could go outside the house and you could remove all the ash and debris from this chamber, this chamber that's in the back bottom of the fireplace. Well, many, many years ago, there was a gas line pipe that was actually put in the back of the fireplace there to bring natural gas into it. And it blocks off, it largely blocks off this metal flap, and therefore it blocks off the chamber. So the chamber has never been cleaned, it's never been touched. since that time. So one of the things that I had arranged with the homeowners was to go there and see what's in the chamber, see if there's something in there. My thought was if the artwork was actually burned in the fireplace, that perhaps some of that debris from the artwork made its way down in that chamber there, and that perhaps there is something that we can identify under an electron microscope that points to the artwork. So I did visit this again just recently with Stephanie. Opened up the chamber, looked into it, and discovered it's actually a pretty good sized chamber. It seems to be a couple feet by a couple feet, square, so cubicle. So it's a pretty good sized chamber, and there's a fair amount of debris in there. It's not full. I would say it's maybe, if I had to guesstimate, I'd say maybe 25 to 33% full, maybe a quarter to a third full. What I did is I pulled out some things there. I put out a very small percentage of the items in there to have them analyzed. I pulled out some ash, and here's a picture of some of the ash that I pulled out. Looks just like regular ash. One of the other things I pulled out that was very, very interesting is this weird, what ended up being kind of a vinyl, black vinyl. And you can see here's a couple of pieces of this black vinyl burned, and here's one picture of it being held up against the sunlight, so you can see that the sunlight actually shines through in some areas. So I had these items analyzed. I sent them off to have them analyzed under an electron microscope to see if there's anything there that can give us any kind of information. And as far as the ash goes, there was nothing conclusive in the ash. There are some interesting things in the ash. There's silicon, which could be part of smalt. Smalt was used in 1600s paint. So there's something there that could be related to paint from that era. There's also an odd array of some metals and things that you wouldn't quite expect to find in there. But I would have to say, being completely intellectually honest, there's nothing absolutely conclusive as far as it goes there. It's a little bit inconclusive. So that's the first thing. The very interesting thing is these vinyl panels, or these vinyl sheets, or what have you, pieces of vinyl that I pulled out. I don't know what they were doing back in this fireplace chamber, but it's very interesting because the closest thing that I've been able to compare them to are these sort of black vinyl sheets that you can get at an art store that have an adhesive on one side, a temporary adhesive on one side. So the whole idea is you could take one of these vinyl sheets, you could affix it to like a mirror, for example, and you could pull it off at a later point because it's got an adhesive, but it's not a permanent adhesive. So it appears to be something like that. So it got me thinking perhaps what we have here is a situation where the artwork was stolen, and there was this sort of vinyl adhesive applied to the fronts of the paintings to do a couple of things: to obscure the paintings so they weren't noticeable, and then also protect them to a certain degree. But that's something that is very interesting to find back there. One thing that I discovered, or one thing that we discovered after the electron microscope analysis, is that there are actually several unknown fibers embedded in that vinyl, in the vinyl and in the ash. And here's a picture of a couple of vials here. The picture on the left is a picture of a vial that contains some of these unknown fibers in there, and you can see they're kind of black charred a little bit. I know it's not the best picture in the world. The vial on the right, I should say picture, but the vial on the right is that of a piece of canvas, a canvas thread for comparative purposes. So obviously I'm very interested to see if perhaps what we collected out of the fireplace is canvas. Now it's important to note that when you're talking about paintings that are 400 years old, these ones that were painted on oil on canvas, the process to maintaining these things involves occasionally applying like a glue adhesive on the back of the canvas, on the back of the painting, and then applying a new fresh canvas on the back to provide additional support. So it is possible that, for example, if what we're looking at here, if what I was retrieved from the fireplace was canvas, it could be canvas related to the original painting canvas, or could be something related to the backing, a linen or a canvas related to the backing that conservationists and so forth, conservators rather, applied to the back of the painting to help preserve these paintings over many centuries. So that's a brief update. That's a brief update of what's going on. There's a lot more that I'm looking into that I'll get back with you on with a different video here. But again, the sad truth of the story is I do believe that the artwork was destroyed, and therefore it will not be coming back. I do hold out hope that I'm wrong about this, and again, even if I'm right about this, it is possible that the Shea Tortoni never left the Massachusetts, New England area, so it's still there. And of course, we do have those two bronze pieces that are still out there. Of note, the Eagle Finial. The Eagle Finial has a separate reward of $1 million for the return of that Eagle Finial. So that is definitely still out there. That stuff's going to be around in 10,000 years. It's not going anywhere. That bronze isn't going anywhere. So unless somebody's got a big, smelting operation and for whatever reason's melting this stuff, which defies common sense. So either way, that's what I've got for you today. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email. That's eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, cheers.